Welcome to this New Thinking for a New World podcast of the Tällberg Foundation. What do the current protests against police brutality in the US signify to non-US citizens? Do they consider the US a racist country? Do they believe the US can transcend its history? In this episode, Alan Stoga, the chairman of the Tällberg Foundation, discusses these and other questions with Sitawa Namwalie, an award-winning Kenyan poet, playwright and performer, Faustin Linyekula, a dancer, choreographer, director and storyteller from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Paula Ordorica, an anchor of a daily news program, a columnist and news commentator from Mexico.
I saw an article the other day that was titled "Transfixed by Disease, Recession, and Outrage." And it went on to discuss the current circumstances in the United States. It matters to all of us whether the United States is in terminal decline or just going through one of those bouts of madness and self-doubt that from time to time seem almost to overwhelm America's better angels. Why don't we start there? What do you think? Anna Paula, is it decline or is it just a hiccup?
Well, at first, when I'm seeing what is going on in the US right now, where you have three big crises, each one independently would be overwhelming. You have the worst health crisis that the US has faced since 1918, since the Spanish flu pandemic. You have the worst economic crisis the country has faced since the 1930s, and the worst protests the country has faced since the 60s, late 60s. It looks daunting. For me, the US is unrecognizable in how the country as a whole, having Donald Trump as its president, but thinking that he is, as you have said many times, and I agree, Alan, he is the cause of and not motive that has the US dealing poorly with all of these three crises, and not only dealing poorly, maybe even making them worse. So I first think that the country is unrecognizable. But then if you take a longer look back, you find that first of all, the US has faced these crises before. And sometimes it looks as if it were the biggest decline, and it isn't.
The question, Faustin, are we the United States recognizable to you? What do you think?
Well, for a long time, of course, the U.S. represented the light of forward thinking and the land of all possibilities, with all its, its divisions, and because these are not new. Like the current riots, they don't stem from nowhere. This is a long history of marginalization, of injustices, which this time, given the current circumstances, makes it just explode. And so I would say I still recognize the United States in that. Already hearing that the Minneapolis police is about to undertake this massive review of how they go about policing and eventually implement changes means that this is a country that, faced with serious threats, can spring back. And to see all the people who've been mobilizing since the death of George Floyd, and even to hear so many former US generals taking the position they did, or even the chief of the Pentagon saying our people are not our enemy, I'm like, well, I know this America. And of course, there is this other dark side, like any other society, like any other individual for that matter. But you have within America itself forces of resistance that makes me, maybe I'm just too optimistic, like, well, at least for now, I don't see like a sign of a collapsing empire. I see an empire which is faced with serious difficulties, a huge crisis, and yet within it, there are forces that can resist. Are they enough to like change fundamentally the course of history? I can't say yet.
Sitawa, how do you see the states at this point?
Okay. I think that it's a temporary situation. I don't think the US is in decline. I think what is happening is that the weak points, the fault lines are being pushed and exposed and have, to breaking and have broken. Because this pandemic, that's one of the things that it's doing. It's showing us the weaknesses, the fragility of us, the systems that we've created, the time bombs that exist that we normally can just, pretend aren't there or handle, with some platitudes. That isn't possible anymore. So for me, it's like an explosion of the underlying issue, some of the biggest underlying issues, particularly race, that have really exploded. And so it's an opportunity to actually face something that the US was never going to face, or wasn't going to face this quickly.
What I think is the most important immediate follow-up, do you think the United States is a racist country?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think the United States is a racist country. I was a student. I did my master's degree in the United States in from 1982 to 1984. I have also visited, and I've had lots of interactions. I mean, the United States is an interesting country because we all have a stake, because we really do have a stake. I have relatives there, friends and so forth. And I was appalled when I went to the US at the level of racism that existed. It was very special.
And Paula, the same question to you. Mexico certainly has a long, intimate, and often unfortunate history with the United States, but also a positive history. Do you think of the U.S. as a racist country?
I do, although I'm saying this in a country that there is also racism, which is Mexico. And this past week, we had manifestations that started in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, pacific manifestations, protests, and a half an hour later, after starting, you had people dressed in black with signs that read Antifa, and the people walked towards a very rich part of the city in Polanco, and they painted the walls saying, how does hunger look from your balcony, you whites? And so I'm talking about racism from a country where I think we also have racism. But I think in the US, what you have is a country that still carries the history of slavery on its back. And it has not solved that part of history, because since the US became a world power after World War II, the country is one where there has been social mobility, where you can achieve the American dream. And this allowed a middle class to become bigger and for this social mobility to occur. And the government then did not work in creating a welfare state like the one you see very successfully until recently in the European countries. In the US, there was no welfare state because you could achieve the American dream by working hard, and it didn't matter if you were Hispanic or if you were Black or if you were Asian. No, but now with a few decades where this social mobility has not become so easy, where children rarely earn more than their parents, where life expectancy has fallen, where inequality has increased, then you are now starting to see in the US that this lack of a welfare state becomes evident. And this makes people unhappy. And part of that is what we are seeing today in the streets, people angry at what one policeman did to one black man. But it is just like the last straw that made the fire burn, no?
Faustin, same question to you.
Do I think that the US is a racist country? Oh, yes. Yes. And this is a country that was built on that premise of like the negation of the humanity of part of its people. And even though we're over 150 years after the official end of slavery, somehow that framed the way Black people particularly are perceived in the US. And you still have a lot of people who cannot shake that off them. And the presence of these forces makes it possible for someone like Donald Trump to be the president of the US today.
Clearly, there is a view in the Black community in the United States that police are bad. That sounds simple, but it's an overpowering statement, and we've seen it in many cases and for many years, but intensely the last days. As you from a distance watch the United States, do you see solutions?
This is an incredible opportunity. What has been only known in the Black community, only acknowledged in the Black community, has been exposed to the rest of American society. And so this is an opportunity for the society to do something. And if I take my experience with police around the world, the first time I left Kenya, I went to the UK, and I was a teenager. I was there to play tennis, and in various tournaments. And so I would ask, the people that I'd go to for help were the police. So I'd go to police officers to ask them directions, and I can't tell you how kind they were, how safe I felt. I was just blown away by their politeness and their willingness to help, and they're going out of their way to help me. When I came to the US, I had already heard and I'd read, America is well known all over the world, right? So I'd heard all sorts of negative things, and I wouldn't willingly go to a police officer. And other countries have overcome problems. The British, I'm sure the British police were not always like this. Were not always like the way I experienced them. The Norwegian police have not shot a person in 10 years. So there is hope. There is possibilities, and one of the things, though, I think it was Anna who talked about the experience of slavery. That is for me the root cause, because when I see the way they treat African Americans as opposed to the way they treat, let me just say, people of color, Americans of color, and as opposed to the way they treat white Americans, it's so distinct and it's so different, and there's a reason for it, and I think those are some of the opportunities you have now to actually address those reasons, the sources, in a very objective manner.
So Faustin, the question of institutional racism versus individual racism, and as you've encountered the United States and as you've watched the United States, how do you think about the institutions versus the people?
Well, somehow I can say that we have the institutions that we deserve, really. And so the institutional racism really springs out of this core group of people, an important, for that matter, group of people in the United States who are still hanging onto this thing upon which the United States is built, which was like, at first it was on the negation of the humanity of others. And like, I'm in Europe right now, and I know that in most European countries I travel to, that question of racism is slightly different in that, like, in France, for instance, they benefited from slavery and all the exploitation of Black people, but it was not directly part of their daily life. So they deal with this in a different way. While in the US, they had to build mechanism of making this acceptable on a daily basis, and that takes time to disappear. So the institutional racism is there because you have all these people who fundamentally think that this is the way things should be.
Do you think that there is a future where the U.S. is not racist?
That's a long process, and it is possible because, again, as I look at what is happening now, and I look at the forces that are resisting this, it means that it will not happen overnight, but it is a process that will take time, but it will happen somehow. Because it's when the time is ripe, things happen. And this is one of those that will just end up happening sooner or later.
Sitawa, is there a time now or in the future when this lesson of history, this impact of history, will be cleansed from the U.S. psyche?
I think if the U.S. is willing to do the work, if you're willing to do the work, this is possible. But unfortunately, if you look at what has happened in history, because Black people are the ones, or people of color are the ones who are whose lives are very negatively affected. They're the ones who had to struggle and fight to get a seat at the table. Those who are sitting at the table already, are they willing to do any work? White Americans have to start being able to do the work, willing to do the work that is required for them to become less racist as individuals, but also the institutions. You know, America has got huge amount of research and wonderful documentation addressing all sorts of issues, redlining, Jim Crow, all those policies that people sat down and crafted to prevent a certain group from moving forward have to be addressed. And then the other thing that is so interesting about America is that, you know, we watch you struggling. It's almost as if you're a proxy for the human race in many ways. So you're struggling and you're fighting, you know, to overcome this and overcome that. And I don't think you should. So yes, we watch you. We want you to be better. We expect you to be better. But it's also for me like you're a proxy for all of us. Your struggles become our struggles. Your successes allow conversations and opportunities to also open up in my country, on this continent as well.
Anna Paula, you mentioned the riots of the 60s. There's been an awful lot of institutional response, I would argue positive response, from Johnson's Great Society through all sorts of programs and spending and laws rewritten, changed, and we elected a Black president. You can make a case that the United States of 2020 is not the United States of 1960 in many positive ways, but obviously there's people in the streets as we're talking today who would make the case that not much has changed or not enough has changed. What do you think?
Well, I think they would be right to say that not much and not enough, but still there has been change. If you look at it from a political point of view, you know that, for example, 92% of Black Americans voted for Barack Obama. And you know that Hispanics mainly vote for Democratic candidates. The white American is becoming a minority, and minorities, all summed up, are becoming a majority. And politicians can no longer disregard this. And that is why you see the candidates from both parties learning Spanish and making some comments, trying to win Latinos or trying to win over different minorities. So I think things have changed, but not enough. But I mean, I think it's not an easy change to come upon.
Faustin, let's talk for a moment about the current president of the United States. Do you think he's an aberration, or does it reflect something of the kind of tensions that all three of you have been describing between the good angels and the bad angels, the history and the desire to change?
For me, it's not exactly an accident or sort, but more of like part of this tension that we've been talking about from the beginning. And there are times when you have the balance of power swinging in one direction at one particular moment. Now, my biggest question mark is about November this year. What will happen after these elections? Will the experience of the past 4 years be enough for people, even those who would say Hillary Clinton is too smart to be our president, and I just can't recognize myself in that, so she can't represent me? Would they still feel so strongly like that they would rather have Donald Trump? That's the big question mark. But was it like an aberration? I don't think so. It's a translation of a reality in the American society.
Sitawa, if Donald Trump is reelected in November, how would you interpret that as a statement about where the United States is today?
I think Donald Trump as a person is an aberration, but he's also a symbol of something. He's a symbol of an America that exists, that has probably always existed, and it continues to exist. And one of the things that I've come to realize is that we exist, human beings exist in silos. So when somebody does something that we don't understand, we often say, oh, so-and-so is ignorant. No, they're not. They have a very coherent worldview, just like my worldview. They will vote for Donald Trump because he makes absolute sense to them. The other day when he went and held up a Bible, you can bash him, but there was something he was doing. He was signaling to his what Americans call his base, right? So he was signaling to them. And I read some articles interviewing people who support him, and they were they've got a coherent story there. They've got a coherent narrative. They understand him. They get excited. So those people are there. They're not going to be. They're not being affected by whether he handles the economy well or whatever he does. They are supporting him.
Ana Paula, I have to add, from a Mexican point of view, the U.S.-Mexican relationship has gone through some very weird turns over the last years. And certainly you had the experience of Donald Trump campaigning against Mexico and against Mexicans 4 years ago.
Well, first I want to say that I was in New York City the day Donald Trump won the election. I was sent to cover Trump headquarters, and I had another journalist colleague sent to Hillary Clinton headquarters, and he has been working for the company that we both worked less time than I have. I had covered past elections. So when they told me you have to go to Trump's headquarters, I was like, why do I have to go there? I want to go where the party is going to be, where Hillary Clinton is going to win. And well, the surprised one was not only, I think, Trump or his team, but I was there and I was surprised to see that the unthinkable happened. He won. And then we fast forward to Inauguration Day, when Trump talked about American carnage. And I had never even heard about that word. I had heard about the American dream, not American carnage. And you could see people sitting, all the people that were invited to be present there, amongst them George W. Bush, ex-president, looking at each other saying, what is he talking about, American carnage? And sadly, 3.5 years later, this that did not make sense now starts to make sense. I think, as Sitawa and Faustin were saying, what Trump represents is more than himself. It's a part of the American people.
2030, American carnage or American dream? Faustin?
See, when I look at the US, I can't help but look at my own country, like in the Congo, where America had represented like an ideal of like an open society, free, democratic, an ideal of a society where everyone, if they worked hard enough, could build their own life and their own dream. And so when I see America in this state, when I look at those pictures from Minneapolis, I see like some mild reactions from Congolese politicians, and I'm like, well, I think the way America treats Black people at an institutional level is exactly how our leaders have been treating us for all these decades. So this is the basis upon which nation states in Africa were invented. It was that story of negation of humanity, exploitation, and violence. And to date, we still treat one another in that way. America still deals with its Black populations in the same way. And yet, inside America, there are all these forces of resistance that somehow gives me hope. And I would say that the forces of resistance constitute like a critical mass, and a mass critical enough that to make me feel and think deeply that even though chances are that Donald Trump could be reelected in November, and the world would have to face this reality, this madness for 4 more years. But for me, it's like, thanks God it's not a dictatorship where you're president until you die. It will be 4 more years, then America will be so broken that, they'll just have to pick the pieces back and do something good after this. So there's still a possibility of a dream. It is very bleak, but I'd like to believe that there's still that possibility for the American dream.
Sitawa, dream or carnage, 2030?
Dream or carnage? Right now, carnage. Your unemployment figures are shocking, and how quickly things started to fall apart was extremely unnerving. And if you have 4 more years of Donald Trump, it's not going to be good. I think it's really going to, you're really going to slide down right into carnage. I think carnage.
Anna Paula? You've told us we've found the carnage already. Can we get back to the dream by 2030?
I think the American dream is definitely still there, and the American carnage as well. So I guess it's a matter of ups and downs, which one prevails. And I think they can both coexist. In an ideal world, hope that the carnage be abolished, but I think that would be utopia. So my guess is both. You will still have carnage and you will still have the dream.
Well, thank all of you for your thoughts, for your reflections, and fundamentally for the idea that it looks pretty bad at the moment, but there are forces, there is a history, there is the possibility that the U.S. can, in fact, again be better. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New Thinking for a New World podcast. We welcome your comments, and please subscribe to other episodes in the podcast app of your choice. This podcast was made possible with the generous support of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.